welcome to Afternoon Briefing. I'm Patricia Karvelas. Coming up, Indigenous leader Marcia Langton and Roy RC join me to discuss the Black Lives Matter campaign in Australia. But first, here are today's top stories. Today, the New South Wales government tries to stop a Black Lives Matter protest happening in Sydney tomorrow.
If you feel so strongly about an issue during a pandemic, please consider expressing your views in a different way.
In Victoria, Premier Daniel Andrews urges people to stay away from tomorrow's protest in Melbourne, where new coronavirus hotspots are emerging.
Don't go to this protest. Make your point elsewhere. You are putting yourself at risk, you're putting other Victorians at risk.
And protests continue across the United States after thousands remember George Floyd in a private memorial service. Black Lives Matter protests are planned in many capital cities this weekend in response to the killing in the United States of George Floyd in police custody and in support of Indigenous Australians. In New South Wales, Premier Gladys Berejiklian is seeking to make a protest in Sydney tomorrow illegal, with police taking rally organisers to the Supreme Court this afternoon. A similar stance has been taken in Victoria, where incoming Police Chief Shane Patton says organisers will be fined if tomorrow's protest in Melbourne goes ahead. The state's Chief Health Officer Brett Sutton is urging organisers to cancel the event, and the Premier has told Victorians to stay away. There are similar plans in South Australia this weekend, with a rally set for Victoria Square in Adelaide CBD tomorrow, after South Australia's Police Commissioner approved an exemption from the state's coronavirus restrictions. In Canberra today, a few hundred protesters have marched peacefully from the city centre to Parliament House. Prime Minister Scott Morrison has joined the chorus of leaders urging Australians not to protest this weekend due to the coronavirus risk.
This isn't about issues regarding people's ability to express themselves and engage in protest activity. We all respect that. But let's respect those other Australians who have gone through such hardship. Let's respect them. Let's find a better way and another way to express these sentiments, rather than putting your own health at risk, the health of others at risk, the great gains that we've been able to make as a country in recent months. And let's not forget the terrible economic consequences of that as well. Let's not put that at risk. Let's exercise our liberties responsibly this weekend. I encourage people not to attend for those reasons and those reasons only.
For more on the situation in New South Wales, reporter Mark Reddy joins us. Mark, why does the government want to stop these protests?
Well, PK, to put it simply, the government doesn't want to see a spike in coronavirus cases. We know New South Wales has really taken some very strict social distancing measures already, and those cases are very low. Overnight, we only had 4 new cases from quarantined hotels among international travellers. And the Premier Gladys Berejiklian is encouraging people to protest, but just to take that protest online. So earlier this week, we saw a Black Lives Matter protest go from Hyde Park to State Parliament and then down to Martin Place. There was around 2,000 people there. They were protesting about the death of George Floyd in the United States, but also the rising deaths in custody among Indigenous Australians. Now, if you look at those pictures of those protests, there is no social distancing taking place. People are wearing masks, but simply because it is in a confined space, and that's what the Premier is worried about. Let's take a listen to what she had to say.
If you feel so strongly about an issue during a pandemic, please consider expressing your views in a different way. Don't compromise anybody else's health.
Mark, there were many Indigenous representatives at court today. What do they have to say?
Yeah, so we saw a number of Indigenous representatives. They first paid tribute and recognised the Gadigal land that they were standing on before they raised a number of issues, including the fact that since the 1991 Royal Commission into Indigenous deaths in custody, which was sparked by 100 deaths, since then there has been an increase of 432 deaths. So they said that that's one issue they're protesting about. The other issue is the fact that George Floyd was murdered in the United States, but they're also wanting better treatment by police. So we saw that really ugly incident in Surrey Hills, a video of a 16-year-old 8-year-old boy having his legs kicked out from underneath him by a white police officer, and that really sparked outrage. So they mentioned those three things, and of course they really want this protest to go ahead, and they want it to go ahead peacefully, but at this stage it really is looking like it's going to be up in the air. Let's take a listen to what one of them had to say.
We are not going to stop our voice, because black lives do matter in this country. They matter overseas as well. They matter everywhere in the world, okay? So you will not silence us. We support George Floyd and the American community and everything that they are fighting for right now. And we support everyone that is standing up for Aboriginal people and black people all around the world. And you will not silence us in Australia. We will be telling you that black deaths in custody will stop.
So, Mark, we're waiting for the court to make a determination about what happens with this demonstration. But despite what it might do, there are many who are saying they're going to go along anyway.
Yeah, well, that's right. We know that there is still the restriction of only 500 people to gather at a protest. So originally when this event went out on Facebook, 50 people attended. That has now grown to more than 10,000 people. And police say it's simply not possible to enforce social distancing with so many people. So at this stage, police are sort of up in the air about how they respond to that. What they've said that if this is considered illegal, then there is likely to be arrests and also infringement notices of $1,000. So we are waiting that decision. It will happen this afternoon, but it will be very difficult to police too, because it'll be hard for someone to say, well, I could just be in this park anyway. And so for them to try and work out who is protesting and who isn't protesting is also going to be a huge challenge. Of
course, this has been an issue, as you know, in Victoria, where there is a protest planned. What's the different way that they're dealing with it? I mean, they're still saying they're going to crack down potentially on organisers, but they haven't taken it to court. No, so it looks like the Premier, Daniel Andrews, he has sort of encouraged Victorians not to protest, but there hasn't been any sort of legal debate surrounding that like there has been here in New South Wales. And so the problem is that people are likely to protest anyway. We saw them going out in Sydney on Tuesday night and there was no social distancing, but it comes at a time when tensions are high and people are really passionate and angry about what's happened in the United States, and they feel like there is a really strong link here in New South Wales. So I think the problem here in New South Wales is that we have had that recent case of an Indigenous Australian being kicked to the ground by police, and so the tensions are high here, but in Victoria it seems like they feel that it might be a bit more orderly as opposed to what's happening here. Well, Mark, we'll be waiting for that judgment and we'll speak to you again. Thank you. And in breaking news, it's just been announced to staff at AAP, which is of course the news wire, that it will be sold to a consortium of impact investors and philanthropists. AAP and the consortium, including former News Corp CEO Peter Tonner, have reached commercial terms and will now enter negotiations to complete a binding sale contract by the middle of June. It means around 85 to 95 jobs will be available to AAP staff. Around 70 to 75 editorial positions will be offered by the new owners, along with other management and support roles as well. So there will be jobs lost at AAP. It doesn't actually save all of the roles. It's a bittersweet result for the staff at AAP, but they have now been informed that this deal is likely to go ahead. In breaking news now. Look, as we've been covering this afternoon, there are a range of other issues happening across the country, including, of course, these protests. At 4:30, we will be bringing you afternoon briefing with the Friday briefing, where we'll be speaking with Marcia Langton. Roy RC as well joins us. They're Indigenous leaders to talk about the Black Lives Matter protests in Australia and the way that those protests are unfolding, including the kind of issues that they're dealing with and the demands that the Indigenous community is now making about policing here and incarceration rates. Foreign investors will face new restrictions in Australia, with the federal government announcing plans to further protect national security. Under the changes, the Foreign Investment Review Board will have to approve all investments in a sensitive national security business, regardless of the deal's financial value. Prime Minister Scott Morrison says foreign investment must be done in Australia's national interest.
Australia has the most liberal set of rules in our part of the world. People can invest in Australia in the way that Australians cannot invest in our part of the world, and that is a function of our outward-looking nature of our economy and under our understanding of how we can drive prosperity in this country, and that is to our credit. But it's important that as we continue to attract the investment on our rules, on our terms and in our interests, then that can be done in a way that is streamlined and it is efficient, and the Treasurer has fashioned reforms to that end as well.
We have taken these steps today to enhance and to protect the national interest. With respect to consultation with other countries, we have, through diplomatic channels, informed some of our key partners about these changes, explained the context for them, as you would expect us to do.
Federal police say they've dismantled a major child sex network operating across 3 states. Officers arrested 2 men on the New South Wales mid-north coast yesterday and charged them with offences relating to the harm and exploitation of children. Authorities allege they were part of an online network that abused children in New South Wales, Queensland and WA. It will be alleged the crimes were recorded and shared with others. The AFP had a warning to anyone associated with the network.
We are coming. We are coming after you. Our investigation into an alleged online network of people producing and sharing child abuse material started in February this year after a tip-off from the United States National Centre for Missing and Exploited Children. Since then, our investigators at the ACE and the AFP have identified and charged 9 men. At least 14 children have been removed from harmful situations. A total of 40 charges have been laid, with 3 of the men facing life imprisonment. Investigators have followed a trail of crumbs from offender to offender.
Tens of thousands of people in Hong Kong have defied a ban on gatherings to mark the anniversary of China's Tiananmen Square massacre. There was a heavy police presence across the city as demonstrators ignored COVID-19 restrictions to stage memorials. Scuffles broke out when officers used pepper spray on protesters. Earlier in the day, there were heated scenes in Parliament when politicians approved a controversial bill making it illegal for people to disrespect China's national anthem. The Northern Territory's journey to a new normal is almost complete, with the jurisdiction entering its next stage of eased coronavirus restrictions. Changes under Stage 3 will allow cinemas, nightclubs and tattoo parlours to reopen, while official sport competitions will also resume. There will no longer be time limits for patrons at pubs, and restrictions on travel within the Territory have also been lifted. Chief Minister Michael Gunner says it's estimated more than 2,000 Territorians will now return to work.
This is a very important day for the Northern Territory. We are where we are because of our strong borders. I see down south some people are getting excited about having 20 or so people at a pub. Now, that's a good reminder of how far ahead we are of the rest of the country. We have been able to do that because of our borders. Our borders have done more than save lives, they've also helped save jobs. More freedoms means more responsibility for Territorians. We all have a job to do. I've got a job, you've got a job. My job is to do whatever it takes to save Territory lives, and my priority right now is keeping our borders strong so that we can do that.
New research has revealed COVID-19 has had severe impacts on life for many Australians living with a disability. The study found many feel invisible, abandoned, with some saying they felt like they were left to die alone without support, and some have even been rationing medication. Elle Gibbs from the People with Disability Australia, which carried out the survey, says plans need to be made so people aren't forgotten.
I think it's incredibly important for all of us to, as we encounter more disasters, as it seems to be, that we have plans to make sure that people don't fall through the gaps. So for too many people with disability, this time of pandemic responses was a time where we lost all of the things that we rely on. So everything from grocery delivery to the very supports that we use to live our essential lives. So I think it's really important that providers, disability support providers, mental health providers, allied health, have plans of what to do in an emergency like this.
Mourners have attended an emotionally charged memorial service for George Floyd, whose death in police custody has sparked anti-racism protests across the world. Family, friends and civil rights leaders gathered at the North Central University in Minneapolis for the first in a series of memorials in George Floyd's honour. His death at the hands of police has caused an outpouring of rage, prompting 10 days of protests in at least 140 cities, with more people rallying today. George Floyd's brother, Mr. Floyd, paid tribute to George, saying he was a powerful person who had a way with words.
Every day he walks outside, it'd be a line of people, just like when we came in, wanting to greet him and wanted to have fun with him. When you spoke to George, they felt like they was the president because that's how he made you feel. He was powerful, man. He had a way with words. He could always make you ready to jump and go all the time. Everybody loved George. We didn't call him George. We called him Perry. If you called him Perry, you knew him direct. You know what I mean?
And in breaking news, as we reported a little earlier this hour, Newswire AAP's management say the business is likely to be sold to a consortium of investors and philanthropists, but there will be some job losses. Political reporter Matt Doran joins me now from Parliament House. Matt, what have they announced?
PK, good afternoon. This announcement's been made to AAP staff this afternoon, saying that this sale is likely to go ahead by the middle of this month. We knew that there was this group of investors and philanthropists circling the AAP Newswire business. We must break down for our viewers that AAP is quite a large business. It's got a few different elements to it. There's the Newswire business, which is employing journalists to report on a wide variety of things, including federal politics. Their office actually just next door to us here at the ABC, but they've also got other arms of their business which look at the distribution of press releases and the like. That's a separate deal to this sale, which will go ahead in the next few weeks. And when we are talking about job losses, we're talking about journalists at the Newswire itself. So around 70 to 75 journalists, it looks like, will lose their job as this business is sold on in a slimmed down sort of fashion. So the business will start to look more at some of its core focuses, so things like politics, things like courts and the like, but there won't be as big a demand for the services in this note that has been distributed by the AAP's chief executive, Bruce Davidson, that there won't be that demand to keep on all of the staff going forward. So journalists, photographers and the like will lose their jobs as part of this sale. But in saying that, there does seem to be a sense of relief that AAP will still be a feature of the Australian media market. It has been around for some 85 years, and the announcement earlier this year that it would be shutting up shop was certainly met with some sense of disbelief and also a greater reflection on the current media market. It is very difficult out there for commercial media organisations to survive, and no doubt today's announcement will still be welcome news despite those job losses.
Yeah, that's right, Matt. Look, I've spoken to a couple of these journalists. They say it's kind of bittersweet. Of course, the sweet is that there is some sort of outcome and that this very old organisation is kept, but at the same time, these are going to be substantial job losses.
That's right. We only have to look at the announcements in the media sector over the last few months, particularly exacerbated during the coronavirus crisis, but even before then, to see just how much the media industry is struggling. There was the AAP announcement, which sort of kicked the ball rolling, if you will, earlier this year, saying that it would shut up shop. Since then, throughout coronavirus, we've seen BuzzFeed Australia's news operations shut down. The 10 network has shut down its 10 Daily news website. We've seen pay cuts at some of the big networks, including the 7 network. News Corp announcing it was going to move more than 100 of its papers either completely online or shut them down, resulting in hundreds of job losses there. We've seen the magazine industry struggling as well. Bauer Media not printing many of its magazines. So it is a very difficult time, and that's why it is bittersweet. Good to see the AAP brand living on, but always a dark day in the media industry when there are those job losses.
That's certainly right. Thank you, Matt. Now, I'll be back shortly with my panel for Friday briefing, but first, Kristen Clark joined me from Washington a short time ago. Kristen Clark, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You're suing President Donald Trump. Why?
Peaceful demonstrators have been assembling in Lafayette Square Park in the shadow of the White House to shine a light on police violence and racial violence in our country. And this past Monday, a number of peaceful demonstrators were doing just that. They were not provoking anyone. They were not assaulting anyone. There were children present, a group of peaceful, multiracial, multi-generational Americans speaking out against police brutality. And they were assaulted by U.S. Police officers, U.S. law enforcement, at the direction of President Trump and Attorney General Barr, who sought to immediately clear the area so that the president could get a photo op in front of the historic St. John's Church. This conduct is abhorrent, and it violates the most basic core principles of our Constitution. And so we filed a lawsuit to make clear that this conduct can't stand in our democracy.
Let's just talk about the implications of that. What are the implications of what President Donald Trump did, and what are you hoping to achieve through this legal action?
Well, the right to free speech and the right to free assembly are defining principles of our Constitution in the United States. And we know that the president believes in free speech. He believes in the free speech of violent white supremacists who assembled in Charlottesville, Virginia for a hate rally that led to the death of a woman named Heather Heyer. We know that he believes in the free speech rights of those who have been recently assembling to protest stay-at-home orders that have been put in place in the wake of the pandemic. We know that he supports the rights of those who are marching with guns strapped around them to stand up for their Second Amendment right to own AK-47s. What he does not believe in is the free speech of those standing up against racial violence and police violence. And that's discriminatory, unconstitutional conduct, plain as day. And we filed suit in federal court, and we expect to win.
The response to George Floyd's death and the men and women before him shows there's a really strong appetite for reform on these issues. Is there the political will? Obviously, this is very jurisdictional. This is something that has to happen in different places across the country. Is there a broad appetite for that kind of reform?
Well, if there wasn't the broad appetite 2 weeks ago, there sure is a broad appetite now because the death of George Floyd was tragic, bitter, horrendous, and every American and people all across the world have now seen this. And we've ripped the Band-Aid off of the systemic racism that has always been there, and it's impossible now for people to simply look away. I can't say or predict where we end up, but I do know that this is a transition moment for the country and that we are colliding with these issues head on, and we will be forced to have a conversation about police reform. There are thousands of police departments across the country. Reforming all of them will not be easy, but we've got to try. And one important starting place will be Congress, and looking to see whether or not they can adopt a comprehensive police reform package that can put in place standards to guide reform efforts across the country.
The protest movement has been going now for over a week. How long do you expect it to last?
These protests may be with us for a very long time, as long as it takes to finally put an end to racial and police violence. I was eating my lunch here at home in Washington, D.C., and was interrupted by the sounds of folks, hundreds of folks who were peacefully marching down a main street just a block away, all chanting Black Lives Matter. I expect that these protests and demonstrations may become a regular aspect of American life. I think that this is a turning point. We are at a crossroads, and I don't think that people will feel a resolution until we start to see real change put in place.
There's heightened awareness around these issues. Are you worried that if something isn't changed, if we don't see tangible reforms in every state across the country, the window will pass? It's obviously a particularly important time in history.
Yeah, Congress doing its job will be an important first step, because there we have the possibility of putting in baseline standards that would apply to every police department, a ban on racial profiling, a ban on chokeholds, a ban on neck holds, creating a database to track problematic officers so that they don't get purged from one police department and then quickly rehired at a police department in another state. One powerful tool that Congress has is the power of the purse. And they can actually, if they have the political will, hold back federal funding unless police departments do the right thing and meet the standards and criteria that they may possibly put in place if we can get comprehensive policing reform through Congress.
Corporate America has spoken out about racial inequality. Do you think this is just symbolic, or are we seeing tangible change?
Well, we're just a couple of days in, but I've been very heartened by corporations like Home Depot and Qualcomm and Amazon and a number of corporate entities that are saying, you know what, we stand in solidarity with you at this moment. We agree that racial and police violence are absolutely abhorrent. We believe that there's work that we've got to do to achieve racial justice, and many of those corporations are backing their words by offering support for the organizations that are on the front lines doing their work. I'm heartened, but we've got to see where it takes us.
We've got our own debate around these issues here in Australia, and of course there are people planning Black Lives Matter demonstrations in our major cities as well. There is a discussion with police in some places. I don't want to get into all of the details which we've been covering, but essentially to try and stop some of those demonstrations because of coronavirus. How do those two things intersect where you are? Because here there's a view from authorities that it's a dangerous thing for people to gather in these mass ways, and yet even though you've got a situation that's out of control in the United States in terms of coronavirus, people have gone and marched on the streets.
Yeah, we've got almost 2 million people who've been infected. We're well over 100,000 deaths. And there was a feeling that we were starting to get on the other side of the pandemic. I don't know what will happen, frankly. People certainly are gathering in close quarters, and many people are being arrested and detained under conditions of confinement that may put them at great risk and jeopardy of contracting the virus. What we know as the baseline is that the pandemic has hit African Americans harder than virtually any other group. And we also know that African Americans are the victims of police violence and racial violence at every turn. So the pandemic's not going to stop the public from wanting to kind of confront these issues head on. Again, systemic racism is what explains why African Americans are at such great vulnerability at this moment in our country.
From far away, we look at your country and it looks like a nation divided. How do you reflect on this moment? Is it a nation divided, or is this a moment which is galvanised around a sense of change and reform?
Yeah, it's a nation deeply polarised right now and deeply divided, but there are those who want and are clamouring for change, who I think are bringing tremendous spirit and courage to the fight. Who are persistent, who are intentional and focused on the singular goal of lifting up the need to address this crisis head on. And I've been very heartened by looking at who's out there protesting and demonstrating. It's young people and old people. It's black folks and a lot of white folks. It's Latinos and Asian Americans. So while we have one half of America, I think, that stands a bit blinded to the issues that we're talking about here, on the other side, you have folks, I think, who are really ready to roll up their sleeves and say, you know what, these are tough issues, but we've got to fight and fight for a better nation.
Hello and welcome to Friday Briefing. I'm Patricia Karvelas. Coming up, Prime Minister Scott Morrison has asked people not to break coronavirus social distancing rules by attending Black Lives Matter protests this weekend, telling them to find a better way of expressing themselves. My panel today, Professor Marcia Langton, the Foundation Chair of the Australian Indigenous Studies Centre at the University of Melbourne, Roy R.C., who is the former Chairman of the New South Wales Aboriginal Land Council and the Prime Minister's Advisory Council, and lawyer and activist Teela Reid. Welcome to all of you. The Prime Minister has joined the chorus of leaders urging Australians not to protest this weekend due to the coronavirus risk.
This isn't about issues regarding people's ability to express themselves and engage in protest activity. We all respect that. But let's respect those other Australians who have gone through such hardship. Let's respect them. Let's find a better way and another way to express these sentiments rather than putting your own health at risk, the health of others at risk, the great gains that we've been able to make as a country in recent months. And let's not forget the terrible economic consequences of that as well. Let's not put that at risk. Let's exercise our liberties responsibly this weekend. I encourage people not to attend for those reasons and those reasons only.
If you feel so strongly about an issue during a pandemic, please consider expressing your views in a different way. Don't compromise anybody else's health.
Don't go to the protest. We are in the middle of a global pandemic. This is serious. Big events are not allowed. Big events are not safe.
If this goes ahead and the protest breaches the Chief Health Officer restrictions, they will be getting infringements in all likelihood for the offence.
I want to bring you in, Marcia Langton, because now there's a sort of really interesting intersection between a push for a protest on some pretty important issues, but at the same time we are in the middle of a global pandemic and we're not meant to be having mass gatherings. How do you view this and the way that it's being handled? I think we've got some trouble getting onto Marcia Langton. Look, while we're having this debate, of course, Victoria is dealing with this differently to New South Wales. Marcia, I understand we've got you with us now. What do you make of kind of the message? Don't go to the protest, but at the same time, clearly people want to protest.
I understand the concern, the advice of the Chief Medical Officer and other medical officers. Here's what I'm thinking. Yes, there's a great risk, and anybody who's sick or at risk should not go to the demonstrations. Everybody should wear a mask. Everybody should social distance, 1.5 metres, and take sanitizer for hands and follow all the rules scrupulously. We might have to take up many blocks if we're 1.5 metres apart. But look at the figures. So far in Australia, we've had 56 cases of Aboriginal people contracting COVID-19, 56 positive cases, no deaths because of our wonderful Indigenous health sector. And I know people will be furious with me from the health leadership for saying this. But on the other hand, we've had 432 deaths that we know of and still counting, because not all the data before 2008 is available, from deaths in custody. And then, you know, during the week, a New South Wales police officer slammed a 16-year-old to the ground and caused him injury, broke his teeth. He had to go to the hospital. And we're told that we're not normal. And we're told not to protest. So when is an Australian leader, a politician, an elected representative going to commit to us that there will be no more deaths in custody and that they will take measures to prevent deaths in custody? When is that going to happen? So, you know, I'm an at-risk person. I'm over the age of 50. Every Aboriginal person over the age of 50 has been declared by our Indigenous COVID-19 task force as being at risk. But it's a risk I'm personally think is worth taking. I'll wear a mask. I'll follow the public hygiene rules. But I worked for the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody. I was involved in writing the 5-volume national report. It was tabled in 1991, and hundreds of Aboriginal people have died in custody since, and the response from Australian governments has been completely inadequate. And I will remind the Prime Minister that the last Minister for Indigenous Affairs, Senator Nigel Scullion, refused to put reducing the Aboriginal incarceration rates as a national priority and refused to make reducing the incarceration rates a target. He flatly refused. So I think, you know, politicians owe us some answers, actually.
Roy RC, you're in New South Wales and the New South Wales government is trying to stop the protest. What are your reflections on that? Because they say this is about coronavirus. It's about the fact that coronavirus needs to be contained and we're not meant to be having mass gatherings. That's what it's all about. They say, you know, there's other ways to express yourself. What's your response to that?
2 points, PK. First and foremost, it's a pleasure to be on your program. A shout out to Marcy and Tila. You know, keep up the fantastic work. But look, 2 points that I'd make. I've got kids, and if you tell them what they can and can't do, or more importantly, what they can't do, they're going to turn around and do it. And I think this is a big red flag to people that are intending to attend you know, tomorrow's protest. There'll be bigger numbers. So, like Marcia, I would encourage people to come out. Be obviously, you know, if you've got any symptoms, you know, don't attend, but wear a mask and, you know, practice hygiene and attend. The other thing that I'd say is, where was this political leadership when the Ruby Princess pulled up in Circular Quay, when we had 6,000 people on that boat, and they let them off? And the biggest majority of COVID cases, I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Patricia, come off the Ruby Princess. And, you know, where was the political leadership then? You know, where was the respect that the Prime Minister saying we need to respect others? Well, you didn't respect, you know, all them people when you let them off the Ruby Princess. And you've got access to resources, you've got a bureaucracy, you know, there's a lot of buck passing. And, you know, we're trying to, you know, someone said in the earlier program that the Band-Aid's been ripped off now. And it's good that everyone's talking about, you know, Aboriginal rights in this country, and more importantly, the people we've lost since 1991, you know, through the deaths in custody, after the deaths in custody recommendations come out, is an indictment on this country. We should be marching, and we should be down there with, you know, with our banners and practicing that social distancing. There'll be a lot of uncomfortable people in this country at the moment around this discussion. I'm talking about non-Aboriginal people, but on the same token, Patricia, to be fair to, you know, not tar all non-Aboriginal people with the same brush, but there'll be a lot of people out there feeling empathy towards, you know, what's going on in this country, and it's about time that we, you know, this has been brought in the light.
Tila, I want to bring you in. The Prime Minister said on Anzac Day, for instance, Anzac Day was observed differently, and it was. Urging people to think about this differently too. I suppose the question is, should there be two sets of rules? You know, some people can go out for this protest, but others have been asked not to go and express themselves on things like Anzac Day.
Well, I think Patricia, this is the frustration in the Aboriginal community, is that there's always one rule for us and another rule for another group. And that stems from systemic racism. People are angry and people are outraged, and we should validate that anger. And if they want to protest, that's their right to protest. COVID-19 or not, Aboriginal people have confronted pandemics in the past, have confronted massacres in the past. If you ask Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people directly, they're not afraid of losing their life at a protest or getting COVID-19 because we're fed up and we're literally dying at the hands of the state. And as Marcia said, that we have had the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody, and we still haven't had accountability for those lives lost. And secondly, the point is the Prime Minister raised the issue. Well, there might be other ways to ventilate and deal with this conversation. Well, that, in terms of dealing with systemic racism, the answer and the roadmap to that is implementing the Uluru Statement from the Heart. If he wants to have a national conversation about racism and systemic racism, but also how we resolve that issue, then we put a First Nations voice to the people and we elevate that conversation.
Marcia Langton, how did you feel when you watched? I just want to bring Marcia in just to ask, how did you feel when you watched that footage of George Floyd? Because I know that it's resonated really deeply with Indigenous Australians, given the shocking rates of incarceration, but also the treatment that Indigenous Australians have endured at the hands of police. Was that kind of, I know some Indigenous people have told me personally in private conversations, it's kind of was actually quite triggering.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Look, I read all the autopsy reports in the Northern Territory when I worked for the Royal Commission into Aboriginal deaths in custody. And there was no warning about the video footage of George Floyd dying at the hands of that officer and officers who watched. I was shocked and dismayed, and I immediately thought that is an outright case of murder, state-sponsored murder. I was very distressed, and I still am. And, I think we have a responsibility to say no. This is wrong, this must not happen, and to show our concern for African Americans who suffer the way we do, and to stand up against racism. We now, at this time in history, have a civic responsibility to stand up against racism. And I do understand that there's a pandemic, and yes, there are huge risks, and I urge everybody to be responsible. But here's the thing, Patricia, that in Australia there has not been one conviction. So the police officers involved in George Floyd's death have been charged. Do you know there have never been any charges in Australia laid against police officers who've been responsible for Aboriginal deaths in custody? Not a single conviction, no charges, no convictions. And as it happened, it's almost as if in Australia there are politicians like the police minister in New South Wales who said that people like us are not normal. How dare he? How dare he? He's cast us as it being insane. Well, here's some news for you, mate. Murdering black people is what is insane. That's what's insane. And that it continues, and that during the week, an Aboriginal child, a 16-year-old, was slammed to the ground by a New South Wales police officer and has not been charged with assault. That's insane. And it's almost, I've got to say, this feels like a call for open season for the cops to come after us. That's what it feels like to me. I hope I'm wrong, but I doubt it.
Roy, I want to bring you in here in relation to this idea that Indigenous Australians or other Australians who support this cause are importing the US's issues here. What's your response to that? Because as we say, Indigenous Australians, they make up 3% of the population, but actually make up 30% of the prison population. I just want to pause on that. I want the viewers to think about that. 30% of the prison population and 3% of the overall population. It is staggering, it is disgusting, and yet that's the figure that we live with. What do you make of kind of the similarities with what's happening in the United States and why Indigenous Australians are so angry at this moment in time?
Oh, look, just before I answer your question, PK, Marcia mentioned the police minister in New South Wales. The Premier said use other options in relation to protesting. Well, guess what? In New South Wales, we can't go to the Minister for Aboriginal Affairs because we haven't got one. And you know, the biggest mobs and the biggest population Aboriginal people are in the state of New South Wales, and they can't even get their stuff together to appoint a Minister for Aboriginal Affairs. I was just out at Walgett and just had breakfast with the chair of Newswalk, Ann Dennis, and she was telling me that they've got all these issues that they want to bring up, but they can't take it to anyone because there's no one there representing our interest. And so in terms of your question around the similarities to what's happening in the States, of course, it's a motive for us as Aboriginal people, as black people, because we've been treated disgracefully. My grandmother lived under that policy of segregation. You know, they weren't allowed to leave the reserve or the mission. I grew up on a mission. I'm a 67 baby, you know, and the gift from this country to me when I was 10 months old was citizenship. You know, so my mother lived under a regime where her rights, you know, she couldn't fulfil the fulfilment of her rights in this country. So, I mean, when we see what happened to that man in America, like Marcia said and Tila's already mentioned, you know, of course it's a motive for us, and we feel that pain as black people because we've been on the wrong end of the stick, and don't take Roy R.C.'s words for that. Go and look at the data. The stats don't lie, PK, and they're not numbers. These are real people. Their families, their husbands, their wives. You know, they're someone's son. There's someone's daughter, and this is what we have to put up with in this country. And like I said, a light's been shone on this ugly thing called racism, and I don't think it's going to go away anytime soon.
Tila, what does the movement call for here in Australia? Obviously, there is, a long list of demands in terms of making changes to the criminal justice system, to the police force, and of course it's jurisdictional too, right? The states and territories deal with policing. I mean, obviously it's not sort of one voice, but what are the immediate demands? What do you want to change?
Immediately, you know, the broad call in this country at all levels of government and the system is to abolish systemic racism. You know, it's not that we think necessarily it's always people that are racist. I've traversed the country with my activism. You sit down, you have a yarn with so many people, and they are willing to open their hearts to this conversation. The issue is the system and the foundations are built on racism. For example, with the Uluru Statement from the Heart and the activism in terms of calling for a First Nations voice to be enshrined in the Constitution, have had to educate non-Aboriginal Australians about how their system is built on racism and they have a race power, and the government used that against Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Secondly, I'm a defence lawyer. I've worked at the front line of the criminal justice system. racism the entire pandemic. And to see that unfold in New South Wales, where we saw a swathe of legislation rolled out that frighteningly empowered the police with more powers to police a health crisis. And what we've seen happen in New South Wales is hearings suspended or the remand population explode, and the police exercise that broad power that is disproportionately affecting vulnerable people, and we're seeing incarceration soaring. So we need to address systemic racism, and the call to action is for the Australian people to stand in solidarity against that. And in order to do that, it's to listen to First Nations and empower our communities. How is it in New South Wales that we do not have someone who is down there in Macquarie Street in Parliament speaking and acting on our interests, when in this country and in this state we've got rapid incarceration statistics?
Marcia Langton, one of our colleagues here at the ABC, a reporter, an Indigenous woman, Isabella Higgins, has written a really powerful piece for our website. I urge people to get onto the ABC website and to read it. And in it she says, reflecting on the mass protests we've seen in the United States, that in some ways Australia's criminalisation of its black citizens is even more pronounced than in the United States, but we don't have music, movies and TV shows explaining it to us regularly. And I want your reflection on that, because it seems to me that that is part of the story here, that white Australia or non-Indigenous Australia is somehow disconnected from the reality of so many Indigenous Australians.
Oh, there's a lot of truth in that. I've said as much myself earlier in the week. Two things about that, Patricia. One, it is true that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have higher incarceration rates than African Americans, and apparently the highest recorded in the world. So that data was reported in 2017. So we are more incarcerated than African Americans, and it's a higher rate by hundreds. So per 100,000. So. Secondly, you know, we are fortunate that we don't have a gun culture in Australia, and we are fortunate that we don't. Our society hasn't slipped into the terrible state of affairs that we see in the United States of America, where the police forces are highly militarised, and where it's apparently conceivable that the military can be turned on its citizenry. Although we'll see about that this weekend, won't we? And I do agree that African Americans have contributed to global culture in an extraordinary ways. You know, they've punched above their weight in music, film, television, literature, and, you know, I myself have been a huge fan. But Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have also contributed culturally, but we have a culture of indifference in Australia where people just switch off and they're not particularly interested. But, you know, the same groovy white kid who will listen to, you know, rap or Beyonce is simply not interested in Aboriginal culture, and yet they live here in this country. And the same goes for politicians. I mean, Morrison, the Prime Minister, said that there's no racism in Australia. For goodness sakes. You know, as Roy said, look at the data. We have the highest incarceration rate recorded on Earth. Now, you know, of course, there are countries that don't report honestly, so I'm sure there are countries where people are incarcerated at terrible rates, like the Uyghurs in China. But at the same time, amongst democracies that have the rule of law and some transparency, that's a shocking indictment on Australia. That is structural racism.
Roy, you were on the Prime Minister's Advisory Council. We talk about the differences and the similarities. This is now a worldwide movement, and Indigenous Australians are clearly now agitating to change the system here, not just show solidarity with the US, but change the system here. The Prime Minister has said, even today, that, you know, there is a priority on these issues. What does the government need to do to show serious leadership around the issues of justice around Indigenous Australians?
Yeah, look, since the demise of ATSIC, we've had a vacuum in this country in relation to a national voice. And fortunately, I was a part of the dialogues that took place around a voice to Parliament enshrined in the Constitution. And that was a comprehensive discussion. You know, it was dialogues from right around the country. I remember in Dubbo, Patricia, we had protests in Mount Druitt. They burnt the front door or the front carpet, and that's what we went through to get the Uluru Statement from the heart. And so we had to put up with all that discussion, to and fro, and we had traditional owners, we had native title groups, we had community organisations, we had individuals, we had leaders from our community. So the cross section of people that attended was fantastic. And to get to Uluru and then agree on that statement took a lot of hard work. And for me, I think, to answer your question bluntly, we need that voice to Parliament enshrined in the Constitution, end of story. Now, that's not Roy RC saying that. That's the people, the mandate that come from the dialogues. They didn't want to settle for anything less. And, you know, I was out in that back country this week, you know, out at Gadooga and Lightning Ridge, Walgett and Brewarrina, and I sat down with mobs and Uncle George and others, and you know, and that's the missing link for me. You know, there's issues around food security. Out at Bourke, it's I think it's about 4.5 hours to go to Dubbo. They can't birth. You know, I know it's women's business, but they can't have babies out at Bourke or Brewarrina. They've got to drive to Dubbo or get flown to Dubbo. Now, if you're a partner, my wife's having a baby and I live at Bourke, I want to be there for the birth of my son and my daughter. And I can't be because they can't, you know, they can't birth on country. Now, what has this got to do with the conversation we're having at the moment? It's got a lot to do with it because we're missing that national voice that can address all issues: social justice, human rights, law and justice, health, education, employment, all them indicators.
Roy, thank you so much, and to the three of you actually for your powerful voices on this issue. I understand the whole three of you, regardless of what anyone says, will be at those rallies. Am I right?
Yes, and can I just add one final sentence?
Very briefly, I'm about to run out of time.
Absolutely. Yep, it's just that we want people to show up. We want the Australian people to stand with us, to stand against systemic racism and accountability.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
well, thank you to my panel. It's been an interesting discussion, and I've got to make it very clear to the viewers, I had no idea what any of you would say before you came on. I was intrigued to hear. That's it for Afternoon Briefing. Thank you so much. I'll see you back on Monday.
Across endless roads, chasing an endless horizon.
What a country we live in.
Backroads returns in a brand new season.
You've got to be resilient to live out here. It's not for the faint-hearted.
Join Heather on a trip across the mighty Nullarbor.
Beautiful region, beautiful climate and wonderful, generous people.
If community's happy, then we must be doing something right.
Not a bad life, you can say that.
Yeah, fantastic life.
Backroads returns Monday at 8 on ABC and iView.
Hello, I'm Ludwig van Beethoven, and I'll always be here for you. When you're full of joy or full of sorrow. I am there when you make history, make giant leaps, and when you're on hold with the power company. Are you there? And you can bet I will be here for you all weekend. It's a Classic 100 Beethoven, this weekend on ABC Classic and ABC Listen.
The best Aussie drama is yours to stream free on ABC iView.
I want you to know that I've seen things here.
Collections of outstanding titles, all in the one place.
Do I have your attention?
All ready to stream now.
Where I'm from, that's called a win-win.
Well, that's quite a sales pitch.
ABC iView, yours to stream.
If the ocean is the blue heart of the planet, then the currents are like the veins and the arteries that just flow around the world.
Come on an incredible journey down the entire east coast of Australia.
The interdependency between this rainforest and the Great Barrier Reef is very important.